Coca-Cola company has been, for us in Guatemala, a symbol of oppression.
Out of the over 4,000 trade unionists killed since 1986, only 5 cases have been successfully prosecuted.
Video went viral, documenting the painful process as she removed a plastic straw stuck in a seat.
These companies that have been paying the AUC paramilitaries have been conscious of what they're doing, and they know what these paramilitaries do. They assassinate.
The company's lawyer approached us was to tell us that the owner of the franchise didn't want a union, that if the workers wanted a union, what they would have instead would be blood.
Hello. In part 1, I talked about the history of Coca-Cola up until the 1980s. Confederate colonels, conmen, Nazi collaborators, apartheid apologists. All the good stuff. In this part, I'll be talking about Coca-Cola's recent history and all of the terrible things it's gotten into and apparently out of. Influencing public health, greenwashing, hoarding and contaminating water, and of course, assassinating union leaders. This is the story of Coca-Cola. So, beginning in the 1990s and ramping up in the 2000s, Coke began facing new scrutiny due to growing public awareness of various issues, and went into overdrive to counteract information that might harm sales of their various sugar water products.
Tang gives you more vitamin C than the finest orange juice, fresh or frozen. More vitamin A, too. And Tang is so much easier to fix. Watch.
Beginning in the 1990s, public health researchers began sounding the alarm on a dramatic increase in the proportion of Americans who were overweight or obese, from 25% to 33% of the population over 10 years. US soda consumption had been relatively stable until 1986, at about 35 gallons per person per year. Then, it increased sharply in the 1990s, before peaking at almost 50 gallons per year, not far off the size of your typical oil barrel. Obviously, there are multiple factors at play, but sugar water, especially the type to contain more than the recommended daily intake of sugar, is most definitely bad for you, causing a spike in blood sugar followed by a spike in insulin, telling the body to store the sugar as body fat, or liver fat in the case of fructose, so you don't die from too much blood sugar. I don't want to get into this too much because it's kind of a different video altogether. Again, there are other factors at play, and there's certainly an argument to be made about why people suddenly drank more sugar, but it is objectively linked to an increase in obesity. And it isn't just soda, but all sugary beverages, juice, sweetened teas, sugary sports drinks, etc. Anyway, American soda companies like Coca-Cola began to feel threatened by this trend because they sold all of those things. So they began investing in methods to change public perception about their products and their contribution to obesity and its associated health problems. Mainly, they needed to invest in independent research organizations and lobbying groups to point the finger away from sugar.
Most of the focus in the popular media and in the scientific press is, oh, they're eating too much, blaming fast food, blaming sugary drinks, and so on. And there's really virtually no compelling evidence that that in fact is the cause.
Now, they actually got the ball rolling on this quite a bit earlier. In the US, there's been concern about marketing sugary drinks and junk food, specifically to children, since the 70s. In 1978, the senior vice president of Coca-Cola, Alex Malaspina, founded the International Life Sciences Institute, or ILSI, an organization that published studies on nutrition and food safety. It was meant to give the appearance of being independent, but its funding came from a coalition of corporate members, primarily food and chemical companies, including Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Monsanto, Nestle, Kellogg, DuPont, Dow, Pepsi, and many others. It was, really, an industry front group, a lobbying arm of the food and chemical industries seeking to promote corporate interests under the veneer of science. In 1986, one of their employees, Michael Goff, who also worked for a chemical industry think tank, wrote a heavily criticized book about how Agent Orange probably isn't really that bad for you. I guess as long as you limit it to meal times. As an aside, the ILSI also played a key role in trying to undermine public health messaging on the dangers of tobacco in the 80s and 90s, and they used the same strategies in defense of sugary foods and beverages. What's been called the Tobacco Playbook could also be called the Sugar Playbook, because, it turns out, many sugary drinks marketed to children were once owned by tobacco companies. Fearing increasing restrictions on marketing cigarettes to children, they began getting into sugary drinks and junk food in the 1960s, and marketing those to children instead of cigarettes using the same strategies. Internal company documents that came out of a lawsuit showed that they knew exactly what they were doing. Philip Morris used to own Kool-Aid, Capri Sun, and Tang, and R.J. Reynolds used to own Hawaiian Punch. Philip Morris also bought Kraft, Nabisco, and General Foods in the 1980s, before selling them off years later. Anyway, the International Life Sciences Institute has heavily pushed the notion of the energy balance framework, that the answer to the American obesity epidemic is only increased exercise, not decreased consumption of soda and junk food. You can eat whatever you want so long as you burn off the calories with exercise. 2,000 calories of carrots is no different than 2,000 calories of sugar water. Just exercise it away. This, on the surface, might sound reasonable, but it is not supported by science, which shows that exercise has a minimal impact on body weight in comparison to diet. But it benefits Coca-Cola and other corporate food interests that were members of the ILSI and supplied its funding. Do you enjoy a litre of Coke and a couple of candy bars a day? No problem, just have a 9-hour bike ride. Marion Nessel, a professor of nutrition, food studies, and public health at New York University, has said the group's work on sugar comes right out of the tobacco industry's playbook, cast doubt on the science. This, she says, is a classic example of how industry funding biases opinion. It's shameful. And this was just one organization that Coca-Cola funded out of many, attempting to shape the perceptions of not only the public, but the scientific community, to prevent people from decreasing consumption of their products. And of course, they've spent a lot on lobbying in the United States as well, about $5 million in 2024, on both sides of the aisle, that we know about. Thanks to Citizens United and the advent of dark money, we can't know the true numbers. But we do know there's an impetus to influence government policy. Just as an aside, an estimated 20 to 25% of all US revenue for Coca-Cola comes from SNAP, food stamps, amounting to a massive public subsidy for the company. There's been renewed interest in banning soda from the program, but considering how much influence the industry has, such obviously commie anti-business ideas might be a hard sell. But anyway, despite all of Coke's efforts, soda consumption did peak in the United States around about 1999 and began a slow but steady decline after that. There were a couple of things that the company did to try and address this. First, borrowing again from the tobacco industry playbook, they pushed hard into the developing world to replace lost US customers, investing about $40 billion across Mexico, Brazil, all of Africa, India, China, and the Philippines. In addition, they got into the market for bottled water, introducing Dasani in 1999, which is just municipal tap water from cities like Detroit that's been run through a filter and sold back to the public for about 133 times the price. They also bought non-soda brands that had the appearance of being healthier, like Vitamin Water, Fuse fruit drinks, Gold Peak tea, various brands of performance drinks, coffee products, all kinds of mostly sugary shit. And this worked. Coca-Cola was able to keep increasing profits year over year despite decreasing soda consumption in the developed world. But there was another problem brewing in the 1990s, the issue of plastic pollution, or more specifically, the issue of more and more people beginning to notice plastic pollution.
Tunaongea ukweli, tumeshachoka. Tumechoka kama hivi tunaumia, sina watuonee huruma. Hatuelewi, hatuambiwi. Mmoja akipima basi ndio huyo na sie tunafuata huko.
Coca-Cola has been the #1 producer of branded plastic waste for the last 5 years running, accounting for 11% of all branded plastic pollution found in the environment. Public awareness of plastic pollution generally started in the 1970s, but was more of an aesthetic concern then. Plastic litter was unsightly, ruining national parks and public spaces. But from the 70s to the 90s, plastic pollution tripled, and it became widely known that plastic doesn't break down or go away, but rather breaks up into little tiny pieces that cause problems not just for our oceans, soil, and wildlife, but also human health. The multi-industry solution to this growing PR problem was to push plastic recycling rather than discouraging consumption. But the majority of plastics can't be recycled for technical, logistical, and economic reasons. The industries that pushed recycling as the solution were fully aware that it wasn't feasible and didn't care. It was a marketing gimmick. I did an entire video on the myth of plastic recycling if you want to learn more. What uplifting fun that was. And Coca-Cola was no different from other industries in this regard. The company produces over 3 million tons of plastic packaging each year, 110 billion bottles, around 1/5 to 1/4 of all plastic bottles produced worldwide. About half of all their products are sold in plastic. So naturally, they got in on the act, encouraging people to recycle instead of reduce, and pushing the concept of a circular economy, a completely mythical concept where virgin plastic can stop being produced altogether if only people took the personal responsibility to recycle, rather than yeeting their trash directly into the Grand Canyon or at weeping Native Americans.
The Great Pacific Garbage Patch between Hawaii and California, which is now over 3 times the size of France.
At the same time, Coca-Cola have spent decades lobbying against container deposit legislation, a system where companies are required to offer a refundable deposit on the bottles that they sell. So, in such a system, you would buy a bottle of Coke, drink it, or water your plants with it, whatever, then return the bottle to Coca-Cola, usually through a grocery store, and they would give you 5 to 10 cents and recycle the bottle, if it can be recycled. States in the US that have container deposit legislation have a return rate of between 56 and 75%, compared to rates of 18 to 37% in states that don't. Coca-Cola, despite its claims to support recycling as the solution to plastic waste, has long fought against the one tool known to actually increase return rates, because they would be the ones responsible for paying the deposit. By the early 2000s, plastic waste increased more in one decade than it had in the previous 40 years, and throughout the 2000s, the public was becoming even more aware of the problem, especially when the concept of microplastics entered the mainstream.
The thing that sticks out to me the most here are all of these kind of perfectly spherical little pellets. There's a lot of plastic production facilities just north of here and in Toronto in general, and so what we see here is basically spillage.
So in 2018, Coke announced an initiative called World Without Waste, where they promised to reduce their use of virgin plastic by 3 million tons by 2025, to collect and recycle 1 bottle or can for each one they sold by 2030, to use 50% recycled materials by 2030, and for 25% of all of their products to come in reusable containers again by 2030. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, none of that happened. Coca-Cola actually increased their use of plastic packaging. By 2030, they're expected to be using 40% more plastic than in 2018, when they set their World Without Waste goals. They're currently facing a lawsuit in Los Angeles over false claims that their bottles are 100% recyclable, and they're under investigation in Hungary for the same thing. However, they've faced such lawsuits before that have failed, usually on the basis that, and I'm paraphrasing here, consumers surely understand that 100% recyclable doesn't necessarily mean 100% recyclable. Anyway, in December of 2024, the company announced they had evolved their recycling goals. They cancelled their promise of 25% reusable packaging, and instead of promising to collect and recycle 1 bottle or can for each one sold, they would help ensure the collection of 70 to 75%. In short, they've started reducing and removing the goals they just set a few years ago, presumably because public attention on these issues had died down. Because, again, this is all just PR. Make promises you have no intention of keeping in order to placate the public, and once everyone's forgotten, gradually abandon those promises and go back to business as usual. As of the making of this video, Coke's World Without Waste page on their main website has been removed entirely. 404, we can't find the page you're looking for. Don't worry, be happy, don't think, just spend. There's really nothing else you can do in the end. And whilst you sit upon the loo, hear perhaps an advert for a product made of woe and woo. The third issue Coca-Cola has faced in the last few decades is that their business model revolves around one critical thing: water. Vast supplies of clean, locally sourced water. Now, the company owns hundreds of brands of drinks, but for the sake of simplicity, let's focus on its namesake brand, Coke. 1.9 billion servings of Coke are consumed every day worldwide, according to the company. Coke is about 90% carbonated water mixed with 10% syrup concentrate to create the final product. The Coca-Cola Company produces the syrup and transports it to local sellers and bottlers, who mix it with water from local sources. For the Coca-Cola Company, this means reduced shipping costs, but it also allows for a level of legal distance between themselves and the companies that bottle and distribute the final product. As of today, worldwide, there are about 200 different Coca-Cola bottling companies. Some are owned entirely by the Coca-Cola Company, mostly in Africa and Southeast Asia, and some are entirely independent. But for many of the major franchise bottlers or anchor bottlers, Coke has a minority ownership stake. So they have a say in most of the operations, and even without any stake, they do have control. Without the syrups provided by the company, there is no product. But if something goes wrong at a bottling plant, Coca-Cola can deny culpability because it's not fully owned by them. The deniability from this, I argue, is the critical caveat of Coke's business structure. Keep this in mind for later. But first, as I said in part 1, it takes 70 litres of water to make 1 litre of Coke. So where does this figure come from? Well, in the early 2000s, Coke was facing scrutiny due to some publicity around its consumption of local water supplies in drought-ridden communities, exacerbating water shortages. About a third of bottling plants worldwide operate in water-stressed areas. So, in 1999, Coca-Cola established a bottling plant in the village of Kaladera in the state of Rajasthan in northwest India. It's an arid to semi-arid region with quite a bit of desert, where rainfall is moderate at best, and the local farmers rely on groundwater for irrigation to grow their crops. The Coca-Cola plant there became operational in the year 2000 and began pumping 52 million gallons of groundwater per year. Over the following 5 years, the water levels in the area dropped by 10 meters. The people of Kaladera were no longer able to irrigate their fields and feared they would eventually have to abandon their village because there wasn't enough water. In 2008, a non-profit group called Energy and Resources Institute performed an independent audit of the Kaladera plant and suggested some alternatives to help conserve water. The Coca-Cola Company rejected them. Instead, they built rainwater capture systems, which they claimed would recharge the aquifer 15 times more than the amount they took. But independent research showed there was no evidence that it worked. By 2013, the water levels in Kaladera had dropped by 30 meters, and Coke reduced its pumping by half. Even then, it remained one of the biggest consumers of groundwater in the area. And Kaladera wasn't the only village where this was happening. Again in 2000, the same year the plant in Kaladera opened, another plant was opened in the village of Plashimada in the southern Indian state of Kerala, where 80% of the population of about 800 families worked in agriculture. The plant began pumping up to 1 million litres, or about 264,000 gallons, each day. A few months after opening, villagers noticed their wells were drying up. Coca-Cola tried to placate them by giving away free fertilizer for their crops, and this free fertilizer turned out, in fact, to be toxic waste from the factory. The villagers used this fertilizer in their fields for nearly 3 years. Independent analysis from British scientists at the University of Exeter found that the waste was not only useless as a fertilizer, but contained dangerous substances like heavy metals, cadmium, and lead, and that it had inevitably spread to the villagers' wells, contaminating their drinking water. Residents were forced to travel 4 kilometers twice per day to collect water outside of the contamination zone. Thousands of farmers in the region were out of work because they didn't have enough water for their fields, and the villagers' drinking water was poisoned. Residents suffered sickness, and the child mortality rate increased dramatically. Yes, The Coca-Cola plant in Plashimada, just like the one in Caldera, was operated by a Coke subsidiary owned 100% by Coca-Cola, and it gave villagers something they knew was poison, and a bunch of kids died. Would it surprise you to learn that no one at the Atlanta HQ ever suffered any repercussions for this whatsoever? In April of 2002, 1,300 villagers in Plashimada began protesting the Coca-Cola factory, blocking the entrance and demanding its closure. Coca-Cola denied that the water contamination was their fault and called the protesters extremists, but offered to send trucks of drinking water through the village each morning. But the protests continued for 2 years and gained international media attention and the support of environmental groups and activists. These extended protests became known as the Plashimada Coca-Cola struggle. In 2003, the local village government revoked the plant's operating license, but the company took the matter to the Kerala High Court, which overruled the decision, stating that a lack of rainfall was the primary culprit, and that Coca-Cola had merely exacerbated the water shortage. Despite this, though, the plant ended up permanently closing by 2005. It's worth stressing that all of the Indian bottling plants were operated by a company which was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Coca-Cola company. Coca-Cola HQ had direct and total control of all this. Many of the plants ended up closing. 5 out of the 24 Indian bottling plants were closed in 2016 alone, including the one in Caldera, partly because of declining demand in India. I can't imagine why. And partly because of depleted groundwater. So, after all the media attention garnered by the shit they were doing in India, Coke apparently decided they needed to change the narrative on their water use. They needed some good old-fashioned PR to frame themselves as caring about water management and the environment. So in 2007, they started a widely publicized Replenish initiative, splashing their website with promises about how Coke would take water stewardship seriously, and assigning an executive to be in charge of global water stewardship. That year, the CEO of Coca-Cola at the time, E. Neville Isdell, gave a speech at a conference for the World Wildlife Fund, where he declared that Coca-Cola was going to replace every drop of water we use in our beverages and their production. That same year, a Dutch scientist named Arjen Hoekstra, who was professor of water management and chair of the Department of Multidisciplinary Water Management at the University of Twente, developed a comprehensive methodology for calculating the total water footprint of any product. It accounts for the entire supply chain of a product: raw materials, production, packaging, everything. It also passes out how the water is consumed. There's blue water, which is water withdrawn by humans, such as pumping from ground or surface water. Then there's green water, which is water from precipitation that's stored in soil before being absorbed by plants or evaporated. And then there's grey water, which is formerly fresh water that is mixed with pollutants to dilute them, such as sewage or industrial wastewater. With this methodology, Hoekstra was able to properly account for the shocking amount of water it takes to produce many everyday products. 214 litres of water for 1 kilogram of tomatoes, 1,608 litres for 1 kilogram of bread, 2,495 litres for 1 cotton t-shirt, 17,093 litres for 1 kilogram of leather. The tool can also be used to estimate the water footprint of individuals and even entire countries. The average German has a water footprint of about 1,000 gallons per day. For the average American, it's about 2,000 gallons. Hoekstra's research makes clear that the water footprint of humanity is unsustainable. By 2030, global demand for fresh water will exceed the available supply by about 30%.
Because of the growing population, the US will have to reduce its water footprint per capita by 2/3. Well, a country like China, growing rapidly in the water footprint per capita because of the meat consumption that is increasing, should also reduce at some point of time. Well, Brazil is kind of in between. Germany, Netherlands, UK are more on the level between Brazil and China.
By 2050, 3/4 of people worldwide will face the impacts of drought. But that's more pertinent for the end of this water series, where we break out the sledgehammer of optimism and there will be much rejoicing. As an aside, Hoekstra also founded the Water Footprint Network, with a website where you can look at the water footprint of various products and calculate your individual footprint. But be cautious. Don't stare at it for too long, lest it stare back at you. So anyway, the Coca-Cola executive in charge of global water stewardship, named Greg Koch, wanted to meet with Hoekstra about doing an assessment for Coke. Hoekstra was excited. A major corporation and beverage producer wanted to assess their water usage and take actions toward conservation. In 2008, he and his team of researchers were brought in to perform a water footprint assessment for a Coca-Cola plant in Holland. They calculated that in Holland, it takes about 35 litres of water to produce a half-litre bottle of Coke, 70 litres of water per litre of Coke, the majority of that, about 56 litres, being used for agriculture, mostly the water it takes to grow the sugar beets that are used to sweeten Coke in Holland. It takes another 14 litres to produce the PET plastic bottles, plus 0.8 litres of operational water used in bottling plants. In the United States, where high fructose corn syrup is used rather than sugar beets, this figure is likely even higher, as corn is more water intensive. As yet another aside, Hoekstra also assessed 2 other products by Coca-Cola. Simply orange juice, about 645 litres of water per litre of product, and Minute Maid orange juice, about 518 litres of water per litre of product. Apparently, Coca-Cola was quite worried about these figures, because they pressured Hoekstra to change his methodology in such a way that would cut the final numbers almost in half by changing to a net green methodology. Essentially what they wanted was for Hoekstra to come up with and accept make-believe scenarios, like, what if the land where we grow the sugar just had natural vegetation instead of agriculture? That natural vegetation would use water too, so why not guess how much water it would use and subtract that from the water we use to grow the sugar? This kind of accounting would have the added benefit of ignoring the water pollution or grey water associated with industrial farming. Hoekstra refused to change his methodology, and plans for him to do more water assessments for Coca-Cola in their global operations were cancelled. Speaking to the Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail in 2009, Hoekstra shared his thoughts about corporate interest in his work. They are all embracing the concept of the water footprint for the same reason they embraced the carbon footprint, because there is a lot of money to be made, not because they are serious about water conservation. There has been a great deal of hype made over carbon footprints, and you will see the same thing happen with the water footprint as it moves up the political agenda. He went on to say, "Already we are hearing people talk about water offsets, because it's cheaper to spend the money on some nice project somewhere than on reducing the operation's actual water footprint. Despite this, in 2010, Coca-Cola published a press release with the correct results of the water footprint assessments. However, the link to download the full report now retrieves a 404 error, and the Wayback Machine doesn't have a copy of the full report either, just more 404 errors. But then, in 2016, Coke started declaring mission accomplished, claiming that they had reached their goal of replenishing all the water it takes to produce their products, and that they'd reached this goal 5 years early. They put out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "For every drop we use, we give one back," and that third-party assessors agreed the goal had been met. Considering what happened with Hoekstra, I can only assume they found some assessors who were willing to do what he wasn't. Because what they actually did was offset about 2 billion litres in 2015, equivalent to only the operational water, the amount that physically fits inside each bottle, about 1% of their actual water footprint. And many of these offset programs don't actually return any water at all. For example, spending money building new wells in small communities in Africa. That is absolutely a good thing for communities, helping them have better access to water, but it isn't returning water to nature. Other offset projects appear to have little scientific merit, like building trenches around forests in Mexico to help saplings take on more water, a practice which has been proven ineffective and actually increases erosion and forest degradation. But Coke got what they really wanted out of all of this, to have a nice marketing story about being more responsible with their water extraction and to distract from what they had done in India. Coca-Cola's water hoarding controversies have continued. In 2017, it was reported that a Coca-Cola factory in Mexico was pumping over 1 million litres of water per day, draining wells so much in the indigenous town of San Felipe Ecatepec in the state of Chiapas that residents were forced to either purchase bottled water or walk 2 hours each day to reach wells that weren't dry. And this is still going on today. The plant now pumps about 1.3 million litres per day, while residents still have to walk hours to reach water that still may be contaminated with fecal coliform bacteria. And the problem has expanded in Chiapas. In the city of San Cristobal de las Casas, population 200,000, Coca-Cola extracts over 1 million litres of water per day, while the city's residents deal with their taps running dry. Some residents there say they only receive water for 3 hours every 2 days. Others don't have running water for up to a week at a time, all while Coca-Cola continues pumping unabated. Then, in Colombia in 2024, authorities announced an investigation into Coca-Cola's unrestricted pumping operations during a drought in Bogotá, where millions of residents were undergoing water rationing. Every 9 days, 8 million people would have their water shut off for 24 hours to conserve supplies. Meanwhile, one of the Colombian bottling companies, owned by Coca-Cola, was pumping 279,000 litres per day from a river just outside of the city. And that's just one of 7 Coca-Cola bottlers in Colombia. The rationing only stopped a year later, in April 2025, after improved rainfall. And from what I can tell, Coca-Cola never had to stop or reduce pumping, not once. Also in 2024, it was reported that Coca-Cola had been pumping water for free from Carragullen, a suburb of Perth, Australia, for decades, even during droughts, for their brands of bottled water. They were approved to pump up to 420,000 litres per week from a property they'd purchased, and didn't have to pay for it because the bore they pumped from was located in an unproclaimed groundwater area. In May of 2024, Perth was going through its worst drought on record, and locals began noticing a shortage in water supplies and criticised Coca-Cola's pumping. The next month, in June, the company announced, and again I'm paraphrasing here, that they didn't actually take very much water, and it was no big deal really, but they would cease operations anyway until the aquifer replenished to an appropriate level. So I guess that's a win, for now. Also in 2024, in the Italian region of Veneto, a severe drought led to a water crisis where half of all towns were rationing water. At the same time, the Coca-Cola factory in Nogara was not only excluded from restrictions, but actually increased production, while receiving a special price on the water, about 1 cent in euros per 1,000 litres, about half the rate paid by residents. The factory pumps 1.5 billion litres of water per year, 3 times more than the entire population of Nogara, about 8,000 people. The nearby Po River was running dry, as were the local aquifers, and residents were urged to restrict their water to only hygienic and sanitary uses. All the while, the Coca-Cola factory was pumping 24 hours per day at full capacity. In July 2024, several hundred activists protested outside the factory in front of police barricades. The next month, the bottler that runs the factory, Coca-Cola HBC, 25% of which is owned by the Coca-Cola parent company, announced they would be building a series of canals in Nogara, with water extracted from a nearby river to help replenish the aquifers. So, all is well. Coca-Cola can keep pumping public water for 1 cent per 1,000 litres and selling it back for €7 per litre. Everybody clapped, I'm assuming. These are just a handful of examples out of many. But are there any examples within the United States? Well, I can't find any articles talking about it, but I do notice that there are some bottling plants in the vicinity of the Ogallala Aquifer. Some are operated by Swire Coca-Cola, a major Hong Kong-based bottler which operates in Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and 13 states in the western US. There's also a couple of smaller independent bottlers over the aquifer, like Heartland Coca-Cola and Chesterman Company. If you are not familiar with the Ogallala Aquifer, in short, it is critical for United States agriculture, and it is at its absolute limit of the agriculture that it can support. In fact, over the last few years, many farmers who use Ogallala water have had to reduce production because there just isn't enough of it. And then there's the paramilitary death squads. Around the same time that Coke was facing scrutiny about its practices in India in the early 2000s, they also faced criticism over their involvement in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of union leaders in Colombia via one of their bottling companies. Similar events happened in Guatemala in the 70s, but here I'm going to focus on Colombia. So Pan American Beverages, or Pan Amco, was the largest Coca-Cola bottler in Latin America in the early 2000s, operating in 8 countries, with its headquarters in Miami, Florida. The Coca-Cola Company owned a 25% stake in Pan Amco. In 2001, the United Steelworkers Union and the International Labor Rights Fund filed a lawsuit in U.S. federal court in Miami on behalf of the Colombian trade union Senaltranal against the Coca-Cola Company, Pan Amco, and another bottler called Bebidas y Alimentos, owned by a Florida businessman named Richard Kirby. The union claimed that the corporations hired the far-right paramilitary group Defense Forces of Colombia to systematically intimidate, kidnap, and assassinate trade unionists and union leaders. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of 3 unionists who had been killed, but they weren't the only ones, and the murders didn't stop after the lawsuit was filed. In October 1996, Sinal-Trainal union members at a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Carapa, Colombia, witnessed the plant manager meeting with the commander of a paramilitary unit in the plant cafeteria. 2 months later, union leader Isidro Segundo Gil was trying to negotiate a new contract with the company. 1 week after that, on December the 5th, members of the paramilitary group United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, drove up to the gates of the bottling plant on a motorcycle, and Gil went out to see what they wanted, at which point they shot him to death. 1 hour after his assassination, the AUC broke into the home of another union leader and kidnapped him, but he escaped and fled to Bogota. Later that night, the AUC broke into the union's offices and destroyed equipment before burning down the entire building, destroying their records. The next week, the paramilitary group lined up union members inside the plant at gunpoint and told them to sign a letter saying that they resigned from the union and that they would be killed if they refused. All of the members resigned. Afterwards, the paramilitary group spent 2 months camped outside the gates of the factory. Eventually, all of the workers, who earned around $400 a month, quit their jobs in fear for their lives and were replaced with new workers earning $130 a month. According to the president of Sinal-Trainal, Javier Correa, 8 union members and 1 union-friendly plant manager were killed at the plant between 1989 and 2002. Family members of the workers were targeted as well. In 2003, paramilitaries kidnapped and tortured the 15-year-old son of a union leader. The same year, they murdered the brother-in-law of the vice president of Sinal-Trainal, and the union headquarters began receiving bomb threats. In 2005, a Coca-Cola plant in Bogota tried to force members to sign a statement saying that Coca-Cola did not violate their human rights. A week later, the leader of the union received a death threat against his family. These are just a few examples out of many. Leslie Gill, an anthropologist from American University who went to Colombia to document these events, told The Nation in 2006 that Coke has a long history of being a virulently anti-union company, and that the violence has been calculated and targeted, and it usually takes place during periods of contract negotiations. And the murders and threats were effective. Over the course of a decade, Sinal-Trainal's membership at Coke bottling plants has dropped from 1,400 to less than 400. Despite everything, in 2003, the judge in the Sinal-Trainal lawsuit said, in short, that Coca-Cola couldn't be held liable for the actions of its bottlers, even though Coca-Cola owned a 25% stake in Panamco, but that the lawsuit against the bottlers themselves could continue. The lawyer for Sinal-Trainal was shocked, believing that Coca-Cola had strong control over the operations of its bottlers, saying, "I'm 100% sure that if Coca-Cola in Atlanta ordered them to change their uniform color from red to blue, they would do it. They could stop these activities in a minute." The lawyer also contended that Sinal-Trainal had witnesses who could attest to the fact that Coca-Cola did have oversight over events at the plants, but they weren't allowed to depose those witnesses. And of course, if Coca-Cola had really wanted to, they could have just threatened not to supply Panamco or any of its bottlers with syrup if they did something that Coca-Cola didn't like. Even if the violence wasn't carried out on their orders, they held the leverage to stop it. They did not do that.
I've reviewed the situation, and I, independently, have come to the same conclusion as a Colombian court, as the Colombian Attorney General, and as the extensive investigations conducted by counsel over the years, that the allegations are not true.
In 2006, the claims against the two bottlers were dismissed as well, on the grounds that the allegations weren't specific enough, and that the court lacked jurisdiction. However, the union wasn't ready to let all of this go. In 2003, they worked with other unions around the world to launch a campaign called the Campaign to Stop Killer Coke, which encouraged boycotting the company. And they did have some success on college campuses, spurring protests and getting some colleges to stop selling Coke products. But eventually, it seems, everyone has just forgotten about this. Their operation in Colombia and involvement with paramilitaries there in the last 10 years is obscure. Have they stopped doing these things? Maybe. Maybe for now. So who's benefiting from all of this? The public health issues, the water hoarding, the pollution, the death squads? Well, the top 10 shareholders of the company today are all banks and Wall Street firms. Berkshire Hathaway, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, JP Morgan, Geode Capital Management, Fidelity, Eaton Vance, Charles Schwab, and Norges Bank together own almost 40% of the company. Coke almost always has its out available, where they can more or less blame others for their behavior. Our bottlers hired mercenaries to murder union leaders. That's their own fault. We'll keep doing business with them though. South American governments restricting water use for their own people while we can take as much as we want. That's their own fault. We'll keep pumping it though. Drought caused by climate change, not our fault, and we'll keep pumping. Tired of all this plastic trash everywhere? Pick it up then. And when you're one of the biggest ad spenders in the world, with $4 billion annually spent on media outlets to advertise your product, it's perhaps unsurprising that these issues eventually disappear from the public eye. There really does seem to be a broad reticence in the mainstream to criticize Coke because they are such a big advertiser. Same, I suppose, as it ever was. And there you go. Also, we can poison ourselves with the acid sting of cocaine-free Coca-Cola. On the next installment of Set Your Hair on Fire and Scream at the Sky, Water Profiteers, I'll be talking about Swiss piss. Won't that be great? Yes, it will be. See you then. Don't forget to subscribe and all of that. And don't let the bastards grind you down. Grind you down even more. Continue to grind. Just resist.